The injuries continue to pile up. We've got 6 teams on a bye this week, and you may be looking at your roster thinking, how in the heck am I gonna make it through this? But this might be the most important waiver wire episode that you've watched so far this season. So lock yourself in, because we've got a ton of guys that could help us through the coming weeks. Yo, what is going on, Headliner Nation? If you're looking at your fantasy team right now and thinking to yourself, how am I gonna make it through the next few weeks? I've got injuries, I've got buys. Well, you are in the right place, because this episode is going to give you some guys that absolutely will help fill spots in your lineups. Now, earlier in the season, we found a few studs that have been great fantasy performers for us so far this year on the waiver wire. And maybe we won't find those fantasy studs this week, but there are definitely some names that could give us some big time contributions over the next few weeks. Hit the like button for me. Subscribe if you're new here to the channel. I've got running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends that we should be adding to our team this week. Some quarterbacks and defensive special teams that we can talk about streaming this week. And then a few players that maybe it's just time to move on from. But let's move on to running backs first. Yeah, Detroit's matchup this week against Baltimore is not great, but given the fact that Jahmyr Gibbs has missed the last 2 weeks with an injury, and David Montgomery left this past Sunday with a rib injury, Craig Reynolds might be a guy that we just have to grab regardless. Now, the good thing for David Montgomery, sounds like X-rays came back pretty clean, but that doesn't mean that, yeah, he won't miss a ton of time, but he could still miss just this week if he's not able to work through the pain. So if Craig Reynolds is starting for Detroit, some of us might be in a situation where Craig Reynolds has to start for us. Same game, different sideline. Justice Hill for the Baltimore Ravens. Now, I've talked about it quite a bit over the last couple of weeks. In between the 20s, it's Gus Edwards. He's getting the most volume. When you get inside the 20 though, and you're in the red zone, Justice Hill is the guy that Baltimore is going to. Now, the reason I'm taking a look at Justice Hill this week and potentially starting him is hopefully he gets some work in the passing game. Detroit is ranked #1 against the run right now on defense. That's not going to take too kindly to Gus Edwards having a decent day. If Baltimore is in a neutral game script, or maybe they even fall behind against Detroit, Justice Hill could see a little bit of extra work in the passing game. Let me go ahead and just mention every backup running back for the Miami Dolphins right now. Chris Brooks and Salvon Ahmed, they took the majority of the backup snaps this past week. Now, Salvon Ahmed was the guy over Chris Brooks, saw more work in the passing game, and scored a late touchdown. But keep in mind that Jeff Wilson was pretty close to returning this week. Now, Jeff Wilson probably is not available in your fantasy league. And I'm going to mention him anyway, just because if for some reason he is, he will be the backup to Raheem Mostert right now. But even if he comes back this week, he might not see a big workload. It might be him and Salvon Ahmed being the two guys that see the majority of the backup work. Because if anything were to happen to Raheem Mostert, we've got to find out who the next guy up will be, because that person will also probably be fantasy viable. So whoever you have available in your league, if you have any bench room whatsoever, if you're able to pick up somebody through the coming buys, I would grab a little piece of the Miami backfield just in case something happens to Raheem Mostert and you need to find your way to starting one of these players. If I'm ranking them in order, then it would definitely be Jeff Wilson, then Salvon Ahmed. Unfortunately, it sounds like Christian McCaffrey may be dealing with a couple of different injuries, and he had to leave this past week early, but it doesn't necessarily rule him out for the coming week yet. But who's going to be the backup? Right now, it's Jordan Mason. Elijah Mitchell was the guy earlier in the season. He got hurt. Jordan Mason has touchdowns in back-to-back games, and that's who they went to this past week when Christian McCaffrey didn't end up coming back into the game. So if you're looking to own somebody, it would be the same guy that I had in this waiver wire video last week, Jordan Mason. If you're already set up and you already own him, that's perfect, because you may end up starting him this week. And I'll tell you right now, if you're a CMC owner, you're definitely grabbing Jordan Mason this week if he's still available on your waivers, because if CMC cannot go, Jordan Mason will be a start for us. Kareem Hunt is still owned in less than 55% of fantasy leagues right now. And this past Sunday, he clearly looked like the lead back to me. Now, other guys are still going to be getting touches, and I know Jerome Ford truthers are going to light up the comment section with this one, but if you're still defending Jerome Ford because you said he had a good box score from this past week, we got to dive a little bit deeper. Kareem Hunt, for a majority of the game, was the guy. He scored a touchdown, he was utilized in the passing game, and he was utilized on the ground. Going into the final drive for Cleveland, Jerome Ford was only averaging 3.14 yards per carry. When you take a look at the final drive where Jerome Ford ran for 40 yards, all of those yards came after multiple penalties that extended the Cleveland drive that should never have been called. Now, if you're a Cleveland fan and you're wanting to argue with me about this, you're arguing into the void because I don't really care. The rules analyst on the broadcast even said the penalties that were called were not penalties and never should have been called. And Jerome Ford's 40 rushing yards came after that. So almost half of Jerome Ford's production from Sunday came after multiple penalties that extended a drive with a worn down 49ers defense that led to that production. I'm sorry, but if you're trying to bank on that every week when Kareem Hunt was clearly the guy for probably 9/10 of the game, it's not a good process for you in terms of starting fantasy players. Kareem Hunt is going to be the guy moving forward. Jerome Ford is going to continue to get some touches. But if you're looking for a guy with the most upside, it is going to be Kareem Hunt. He is their running back going forward. Emari Demercado was on my waiver wire show last week, but it came to start and sits for the week. I told everybody, I'm not starting him. I can't trust it. I don't know what they're going to do with that backfield. Later on in the week, it was said that Keontae Ingram was going to be removed from the injury report and should be healthy for Sunday, which led to even further confusion in the backfield. And sure enough, Keontae Ingram ended up being the guy. So if you're looking for the starting running back to replace James Conner while he's banged up, Keontae Ingram looks to be the guy. He had the most volume and he was also the most efficient. And Arizona wants to continue to run the football. They don't want to get pass heavy. That's not the type of offense that they are. They might not have the best matchups in the world that you want to start Keontae Ingram in, but again, beggars can't be choosers right now. If we're dealing with injuries and buys, we may not have a choice. We want to start the running backs that are probably going to get us the most volume, and Keontae Ingram could definitely be one of those guys. I definitely feel like people are going to forget that Jaylen Warren is just sitting on waivers after their bye week last week. And going into their bye, he's been a much better running back than what Najee Harris has been. Jaylen Warren is going to be a starter for us in the coming weeks, especially PPR leagues. If you're dealing with injuries, if you're dealing with bye weeks, and you're looking for guys to flex or RB2 players, Jaylen Warren will be one of the first guys every single time I say, hey, if we got to roll with somebody, let's roll with Jaylen Warren. Jaylen Warren is one of my priority pickups this week if he's still available in your leagues. And right now it appears he's still available in under 60% of fantasy leagues. So keep an eye on your league and see if he's still out there. And if he is, let's take a shot on him this week. He's going to get plenty of work in the passing game, and he's still going to see touches on the ground. We got a couple of running backs on buys that we might just want to keep an eye on in case you want to jump on them a little bit earlier. And it's Tyjae Spears from Tennessee, and it's Devin Singletary from Houston. For Spears, I'm still not buying into the fact that he is a fantasy startable player for us. He had one big play this past week, and Derrick Henry was still the guy. Yes, he is seeing more snaps. He's seeing more snaps in negative game script, but he's still not being utilized. The only reason we really should be owning Spears at this point is if we also own Derrick Henry and you're backing up Derrick Henry. Spears is only going to be fantasy viable if something happens to Derrick Henry. People are arguing, but he's seeing more snaps and he's on the field more often. It doesn't matter. It's because Tennessee keeps putting themselves in a negative game script, and Tyjae Spears still isn't giving you fantasy viable performances. That says a lot about whether or not we should be starting him, not whether or not he's taking a snap and Derrick Henry isn't. So for him, we're not adding him unless we own Derrick Henry, but I'm going to throw him out here anyway because I know people are going to be asking about him. And as far as Devin Singletary goes, he ended up taking over as the lead back for Dameon Pierce this past week, which is really concerning. And we're going to dive into some Dameon Pierce film this week for our members only video, so keep an eye out for that. But Devin Singletary seeing so many touches this past week is definitely concerning. If he ends up being the lead back moving forward, we're definitely need to consider replacing Dameon Pierce with Devin Singletary. We're going to kick off wide receivers with Jameson Williams from the Detroit Lions, and when you take a look at what this guy did this past week, he's not seeing a ton of volume, but the big play potential is going to be there. And the number one quarterback in football in terms of completions of 20 or more yards the last 2 years is Jared Goff. Amon-Ra St. Brown is healthy. Sam Laporta was somewhat healthy this past week, even though those drops didn't really help him. And of course, they run the football so well in Detroit that it opens up a lot of one-on-one matchups down the field. Jameson Williams is not going to give you a ton of volume, but he's going to give you some big play upside. Trey Palmer from Tampa Bay is a guy that is still seeing a decent amount of looks from Baker Mayfield, especially if they find themselves in negative game script. He had 7 targets this past week, which tied with Chris Godwin. And Trey Palmer has a little bit more big play potential than what Chris Godwin does. He's not really anything more than maybe a flex or a wide receiver 3 option for our fantasy teams, but if Tampa Bay finds themselves behind, Trey Palmer is going to find himself with some targets. Rashee Rice finally flashed some of his big play potential, catching 4 passes for 72 yards against Denver this past week. Someone's going to have to step up in Kansas City. Can it be Rashee Rice? Maybe this past week is a building block to him finally settling in as the wide receiver 1 for Kansas City. Curtis Samuel was second on the team in targets this past week, and he leads the team in targets over the last 3 weeks with touchdowns in back-to-back games. He's not flashy, and he's not putting up huge games for you, but Sam Howell has kind of reverted back to staying within himself. He's not taking as many chances down the field that he did in the previous 2 weeks. He was much safer this past week, and Curtis Samuel is a big part of that. Expect him to still be a decent flex option for us in the coming weeks. Jackson Smith-Njigba is not a priority add for us, but DK Metcalf, even though he came back into the game, had to leave with a hip injury this past week. We'll see if that's something that lingers. If it does, Jackson Smith-Njigba definitely could see himself becoming the wide receiver 2 and number 2 in targets for this team if DK Metcalf would have to miss any time. In the 3 games that Gardner Minshew played a majority of the game at quarterback, Josh Downs has seen 27 targets. He is definitely a guy, and he scored a touchdown this past week that Gardner Minshew is looking towards in really any type of situation. Yes, some negative game script definitely helped out with targets this past week, but it doesn't matter. Josh Downs at any situation is being looked to by Gardner Minshew, and he's definitely a guy in PPR formats that has a really nice floor for us right now. Another name just to keep on the radar, Tyreek Hill had to come out of this past week's game, dealing with some cramping, they said, but you really never know. Braxton Berrios, if for any reason Tyreek Hill were to miss a game, would definitely step in as the wide receiver 2 behind Jalen Waddle. Juwan Jennings could end up seeing an increased target share over the coming weeks, especially if Deebo Samuel and Christian McCaffrey both end up needing to miss time. And even if CMC doesn't miss time, if he's banged up, they're probably not going to want to utilize him in the air any more than what they need to. It's still going to be Brandon Ayuk, and it's still going to be George Kittle. But if San Francisco finds themselves in a passing situation, Juwan Jennings is the number 3 target on that team. Probably isn't the worst thing in the world. Now that Derek Carr's shoulder looks like it's healed up and feeling a lot better, his ability to push the ball down the field is getting better as well, and Rashid Shaheed is definitely the benefactor of that. The big play guy in this offense, he's not going to put together a ton of volume, but he's definitely a threat to take one to the house every single week. They used him in the backfield a couple of times this past week, and you know what? If he returns punts or kickoffs, then you definitely have an opportunity for some extra points there as well. Rondale Moore and Michael Wilson are both guys that we should keep an eye on as well. Rondale Moore had 7 targets this past week, which was second on the team, but more importantly, they actually put him in the backfield a few times as well. With the injury to James Conner, is this a guy that gets a little bit of a hybrid role and starts seeing some handoffs and some plays out of the backfield? If it is, he could definitely become a guy that we take a look at over the next couple of weeks. And for Michael Wilson, people were jumping on board after his first couple of weeks of the season. He's quieted down a little bit since then, but about some big play potential showing up this past week leads us to believe that there could be some more opportunity there again moving forward. Wan'Dale Robinson caught all 8 of his targets for 62 yards against the Buffalo Bills this past week. He's got a nose for the first down marker. When you throw him the football and he catches it, the dude just tries to get upfield right away. He's not flashy. He doesn't do anything crazy. The dude just plays really good football. And he is a priority add for us this week if we're dealing with any type of issues at the wide receiver position, especially in PPR leagues. Wan'Dale Robinson definitely needs to be one of the first guys up for wide receivers this week, and you should be taking a look at him in all formats. Got a couple of guys on a bye as well that we're just going to toss out, just like we did with running backs, Allen Lazard and Tyler Boyd. Garrett Wilson was banged up at the end of their game this past week, and maybe it's not anything that lingers into the bye and then even after the bye. He's got plenty of time to just chill and try and heal up a little bit. But if Garrett Wilson is dealing with anything that could lead to missed time, Allen Lazard would become the #1 wide receiver on this team. And then as far as Tyler Boyd goes, there's not really much to say about him. T. Higgins is banged up. He's dealing with the rib injury right now. Tyler Boyd didn't do anything 2 weeks ago. In fact, his team just completely forgot about him. And then all of a sudden he comes back this week and has a decent game for us. So if T. Higgins continues to be bothered by the rib injury, Tyler Boyd is still a guy we'll keep our eye on. Believe it or not, we've got a couple of tight end options in the waiver wire video this week that we could pick up and probably start right away. And it all begins with Jonnu Smith. I think people have continued to be kind of on the fence about him. He's had a very safe floor, but he finally scored this week, which is something we talked about in the start and sit video last week, that if he scored, his upside would become a middle of the road tight end 1 for us. Jonnu Smith is looking really good right now, and he's seeing a lot of targets. If he's still available out there, he's definitely a guy that you should be picking up and starting over a majority of the other options. I absolutely hate to say it, but after 7 receptions this past week, I have to bring up Taysom Hill as a tight end, because if I don't, the Taysom Hill truthers are going to come after me, and I just want to keep them quiet for another week. 7 receptions is pretty decent, and when you're facing injuries to your starting tight end like Juwan Johnson, you still have Foster Moreau, but you're just moving guys in and out of the position, trying to get something going in this offense. And because we're dealing with injuries and a lot of buys right now, maybe you find yourself in a position where you have to throw Taysom Hill out there. I would still try and look for other guys. There's even guys on this list right now that I would start over him pretty easy, but maybe he makes his way into my top 18 tight ends this week. Jonnu Smith is the first priority add at the tight end position. Michael Mayer is the second priority add. And last week we saw a little bit of a creep up in terms of production and how he was being utilized, which is good because the dude hasn't done anything all year long. And then all of a sudden, Michael Mayer comes out on the first drive of the game this past Sunday and doubles his production from the entire season before that. You can't make that crap up. We're going to be adding him, though, because if they do continue to use him like this, he's going to be a guy that would become a safe starting option at the tight end position. However, a majority of his work this past week came with Jimmy Garoppolo, who's dealing with a back injury that was apparently so severe, he had to leave the game early and go to the hospital. Are we picking up Michael Mayer? Yes. Are we starting him right away? I don't know if we'll do that. We have to wait and see. Trey McBride and Zach Ertz tied for 5 targets this past week, but Trey McBride greatly outproduced him. Zach Ertz has seen a pretty safe floor recently because of how many targets he's gotten. But if McBride is all of a sudden going to start hopping over him in terms of targets, then Zach Ertz will go to the back, and Trey McBride will definitely jump into a conversation of a starting tight end in fantasy. And once again, I'm bringing up a New York Jet because Garrett Wilson was banged up at the end. Going into the bye, we're not picking up Tyler Conklin right now, but if Garrett Wilson has anything at all that lingers, Tyler Conklin could see an increased workload over the next couple of weeks. All right, there's the meat and potatoes of the video, but if you're looking for some streaming options, let's go ahead and start with quarterbacks, and Derek Carr is going to be first up for me. Definitely going to have a pretty decent matchup coming up this week against a Jacksonville team that allowed over 300 passing yards to Gardner Minshew. Derek Carr looked a lot healthier this past week, which is great for him and New Orleans, and he's definitely a streaming option going up against Jacksonville. Malik Cunningham could end up being the starting quarterback for New England when they face Buffalo this week. It would not shock me if the Mac Jones era in New England is finally over with. Unless they want to get that first overall pick, then they'll just continue to start Mac Jones because that's what they've been good at this season. But Malik Cunningham, he's not going to be a guy that realistically we're wanting to start. But once again, if you're out of options, if you're in a super flex league, if you're in a 2-quarterback league, Malik Cunningham might be a guy that we just take a shot at and we say, you know what? Hey, Malik Cunningham could be fun to watch this week, and fantasy football is fun to play. I was really impressed with Sam Howell this past week because in his past few performances, you could tell that he was doing a little too much, trying a little bit too hard, forcing the ball into windows that he shouldn't have, throwing some bad interceptions. And then this past week, he just stepped back and played within himself again. And because of that, this week, he's back to being a really good streaming option for me. Even though he doesn't have a ton of upside, he's still giving you a really nice floor at the position every week right now. If you're looking for a streaming defense this week, it's going to be the Battle of the Bays, and we'll start with Tampa Bay going up against Atlanta. The key to being Atlanta is making them one-dimensional. If you can shut down the run, which Tampa Bay just did to Detroit, you can force Desmond Ridder into some bad throws and some turnovers. Even before David Montgomery got injured in this game against Tampa, he wasn't looking that great. He was averaging well under 4 yards per carry, and then Craig Reynolds didn't do a whole lot after that. Tampa Bay has a great stout defense on the line. If they can shut down Bijan Robinson and Tyler Algier, they've got a shot to shut down the entire offense. Green Bay already has the advantage over Denver right now. They're coming out of the bye and they're going to be getting an offense that is just all over the place and can't seem to figure out how to function correctly. Green Bay is a really great streaming option this week if they can just shut down Denver and keep Russell Wilson at bay, which a lot of teams have been able to do so far this year. I've only got 4 guys to talk about on our drop list this week, and if there's anybody that you're thinking about dropping, make sure you leave me a comment down below, and I'll get to as many as I can. Make them short and sweet. Just put drop with whatever player, and then put add with whatever player you want to add, and I'll tell you yes or no, and that will help me get to as many as possible. Dalvin Cook and Tutu Atwell were both brought up last week. Tutu Atwell only 1 catch this past week. Dalvin Cook is essentially the handcuff to Breece Hall. The only reason that we should own Dalvin Cook anymore is if we own Breece Hall, so then you can handcuff him if anything were to happen to him. But Dalvin Cook is no longer even being considered as a startable option on his own. Now, unfortunately, my boy Hunter Henry, who got off to a hot start this year, is falling into the drop category for me this week. Mac Jones has played like absolute crap, and it definitely looks like Mac Jones is going to be replaced as the starter for New England, and I don't know if that's going to happen yet or not. We'll have to keep an eye on it. But Mac Jones and Hunter Henry were boys. If that's not the case moving forward and Mac Jones isn't the starter, there's no telling what could happen with Hunter Henry. If he ends up going off with Malik Cunningham or Bailey Zappi or whoever, then we can pick him back up later on. But for right now, he's just not startable. And then Matt Breida, if you were holding on to him because you were using him while Saquon Barkley was out, it's exactly like Dalvin Cook. Saquon Barkley saw 26 carries this past week, clearly back, clearly feeling better. Even if he is not 100% yet, Matt Breida is no longer a starting option for us. The only people that should have him on their roster are Saquon Barkley owners. All right, Headliner Nation, there you have it. Lots of names that we had to discuss this week. Make sure you hit the like button for me. Make sure you subscribe to the channel. And once again, if there's some players that you're thinking about dropping that I didn't include in the drop section of this video, leave me a super quick comment below. Just put drop whoever, put add whoever, and I'll reply with yes or no, and I'll get to as many as I can. But Headliner Nation, I've got a ton of other stuff to do to get ready for this week. Lots of running back stuff we got to break down. So peace out, stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.